Hey, everyone, tonight we dive into the hidden world behind convent walls, where piety and chastity were preached, but not always practiced. The Middle Ages left us grand cathedrals and sacred manuscripts, but also court records, confessions, and letters that reveal a far less saintly side of medieval nuns, secret lovers, hidden pregnancies, escape tunnels, and even full-blown orgies conducted under the guise of spiritual ecstasy. It's quite a story, so dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into this journey together. When a woman entered a medieval convent, she was expected to leave the world behind. Her dresses, jewelry, last name, and any chance of physical affection. Ever, in theory, she became a bride of Christ. In practice, the marriage was often open to interpretation. The vow of chastity was serious business. No touching, no flirting, definitely no midnight rendezvous in the cloister garden with Brother Thomas from down the hill. But, as any good historian or bishop with a headache will tell you, vows are only as binding as the will to follow them. And in many convents, that will was flexible. For some nuns, chastity was more of a suggestion. After all, if you're locked behind stone walls for decades, surrounded only by other women and the occasional suspiciously handsome confessor, things can get blurry, very blurry. Some got creative. There were whispered arguments that affection didn't count if it wasn't intentional. Others leaned into spiritual loopholes. If Christ was your heavenly husband, who could object to a little passion, mystical or otherwise? Especially if you wrote it down in Latin. Reports from church officials sent to check on purity often contained delicately phrased complaints, like excessive familiarity between sisters, or unescorted male visitors to the orchard. Translation: someone was misbehaving, and it was probably near the apples. Then there were convents that ran like noble dormitories. Wealthy families sent their troublesome daughters, expecting someone else to deal with their enthusiasm. Some convents tried, others shrugged and hoped the bishop didn't visit too often. Of course, not every nun strayed. Many lived genuinely devout lives, praying, studying, and baking bread that could dent a helmet. But others, let's just say they interpreted chastity the way people today interpret unlimited breadsticks. Chastity was sworn before God, written in ink, embroidered into rule books. But behind those quiet walls, things were occasionally rewritten. Pregnancy, as a general rule, is hard to explain away, especially when you're a nun. You could conceal a secret lover or smuggle a wheel of contraband cheese. But a growing belly was harder to tuck under a habit, and explaining it without implicating at least one person, several sins, and occasionally a confused donkey, nearly impossible. Medieval convents were supposed to be sanctuaries of chastity, but reality had other ideas. church records, bishops' complaints, and truly scandalized abbesses all suggest one truth. Nuns were getting pregnant, not hypothetically, not symbolically, physically, undeniably, inconveniently pregnant. The excuses were creative. Some claimed demonic possession, others cited miraculous conception, which, while possible in biblical precedent, was met with skepticism when it involved Brother Jacques, the choir director, 3 towns over. One nun even claimed she fell on a man. Hard to argue with gravity. Once discovered, convents responded with panic and strategic memory loss. The pregnant nun might be sent on a retreat or develop a sudden, prolonged illness requiring total seclusion. If she gave birth, the baby might be whisked away under cover of night to a foundling home, a sympathetic relative, or, in darker cases, nowhere good at all. Some infants were quietly buried on convent grounds, with headstones that read, like vague apologies to God, the Father. That was always the next question. Answers varied. Priests, travelling nobles, gardeners. In one memorable trial, the accused was a wandering musician with a harp and an indecent smile. No further explanation needed. Punishment was inconsistent. Peasant-born nuns might be excommunicated and sent away in disgrace. Noble-born sisters often got stern warnings and a sabbatical. One brazen abbess, caught with a lover and a child, still kept her job. Clearly, management worked differently back then. The church insisted these were isolated incidents, rare, tragic, deeply regrettable. Yet, the archival paper trail says otherwise. Parchment doesn't lie, especially when it's soaked in scandal. Love in the cloister was a delicate operation, silent, coded, and written in flowery Latin that could pass as a romantic confession or a very intense prayer. Nuns took vows of silence, but their quills were far less obedient. Letters were everything when face-to-face trysts were too risky, and meaningful glances across the chapel grew unfulfilling. Love found its loophole through ink and wax. Some letters were slipped through cracks in the cloister wall. Others were tucked into loaves of bread or passed by suspiciously helpful novices with excellent poker faces. The contents ranged from sweet to unprintable. One nun wrote to her priest lover that she longed to drink of his chalice of devotion. The bishop investigating was so unsettled, he ordered the letter burned twice, just to be sure. These romances weren't always fleeting. Some lasted years. One nun in France maintained a correspondence with a young nobleman for over a decade, outliving 2 abbesses and 3 failed attempts to catch her. She was finally exposed after quoting Ovid too accurately in the convent's choir book. The church took a dim view of this literary lust. When letters were discovered, punishments followed: excommunication, penance, confinement to solitary prayer, or worse, a public reading of the letters before the entire convent, more humiliating than divine judgment. If the lovers were men of the cloth, They were reassigned to colder, less romantic posts. If layman, one was once flogged, fined, and ordered never to speak to women of the cloth again. His reply, "Can I still write?" Embarrassing, yes, but the ink kept flowing. When walls were high and eyes were watching, love adapted with metaphor, innuendo, and very determined handwriting. In theory, a convent was a fortress of purity. In reality, it was more like a boarding school with walls and, in some cases, surprising escape routes. Medieval nuns weren't just spiritually restless. Some were physically inventive. Forget dainty women tiptoeing through rose gardens. Some scaled walls with bed sheets, bribed guards, crawled through drains, or, in one case, dressed as a monk and walked out the front door like it was a normal Tuesday. Motivations varied. Some fled to reunite with lovers, others hated monastic life. A few realized eternal silence meant exactly that, even during meals. The most legendary escapee was Sister Benedetta of Verona. Sent to the convent at 14, she made 3 attempts to flee. On her 3rd try, she disguised herself as a novice from a neighbouring abbey, forged travel papers, and escaped on a vegetable cart. She made it halfway to Venice before being caught, not for her disguise, but for flirting with the guard. Some escapes were dramatic. In Saxony, a group of nuns staged a collective breakout after their abbess banned music. They overpowered the gatekeeper with stale bread and vanished into the woods. Church authorities called them disoriented and unrepentant, a tagline for an excellent medieval drama. When caught, escaped nuns were hauled back, subjected to public shame, fasting, or locked in a cold stone room with only a crucifix and disappointment. Repeat offenders might be sent to stricter convents, where the food was worse and the walls higher, but for some, even that couldn't extinguish rebellion. A few escaped, married their lovers, and lived out their days pretending they'd never seen a cloister. Sometimes the habit just didn't fit, and the window was open. Every scandal has its icon, and Sister Agnes of Würzburg deserves her own stained glass window, preferably one that blushes. Agnes was intelligent, charming, and gifted in music, prayer, and hosting a night in her cell for over a year. Yes, a real night. Armor, sword, probably a tragic backstory. His name is lost to history, which is suspicious in itself. He was reportedly recovering from battle wounds, though where this battle took place is unclear. Maybe in a field, a tavern, or the convent courtyard after he tripped sneaking in. The night was discovered after a novice reported strange clanking noises from Agnes' cell. Church officials found him hiding behind a tapestry, eating preserved figs, humming hymns to pass the time. His defense? Sister Agnes is a healer of both body and soul. Agnes didn't deny the affair. She seemed annoyed to be interrupted, claiming she was caring for the wounded, as compassion is a holy virtue. True, but rarely used to justify cohabitation with a chain-mailed boyfriend. The scandal rocked the convent, not just for the affair, but for its duration. A few weeks might be forgivable, 12 months, with the knights seen twice in a borrowed monk's robe, helping with garden chores, took planning and commitment. Agnes was stripped of her position, publicly shamed, and reassigned to a stricter order. The knight was fined and exiled, though one record notes he did not seem regretful. The most medieval way of saying he smirked the whole time. Agnes later wrote letters protesting the church's hypocrisy, quoting scripture and medical texts. One line stood out: "Had I let him die, I'd be a sinner still." Not all scandals involved sneaking nights or secret letters. Some were louder, moaned, wept, and trembled in public view, claiming divine contact. Enter the mystic nun. In the Middle Ages, certain nuns were known for ecstatic religious visions, not quiet reflection, but full-bodied, eyes rolled back, trembling on the floor encounters. Some church officials called them holy. Others had questions. Mostly, why did these visions sound so enthusiastic? Take Sister Beatrix from the Low Countries, who claimed Christ came to her nightly, not metaphorically, but physically. Her writings described embraces of divine warmth and spiritual union beyond the veil of flesh. She declared herself wedded to the Lamb, which sounds innocent until you read her comparisons to fire that spread within and without. Subtle. Then there's Hadderwijch of Antwerp, a 13th century mystic whose poetry reads like a steamy romance novel set in a chapel. She wrote of consuming love and being pierced by divine light. Some lines were so vivid, later scholars tried to edit them into tamer metaphors. The originals, however, are preserved and eyebrow-raising. To be fair, not every nun faked their ecstasy. Many were sincere. Medieval theology encouraged intense emotional relationships with Christ, sometimes verging on PG-13 language. But sincerity didn't cancel the stirrings, spiritual or otherwise. Some bishops accused these women of attention-seeking. Others worried about their influence on younger nuns. One skeptical archbishop called it hysteria masquerading as holiness. He was later reassigned, possibly for saying what everyone was thinking. Still, some mystic nuns became celebrities. Their visions recorded, bishops copied and venerated. Medieval divine fan fiction called theology. If monasteries were known for restraint of body, tongue, and stomach, fasting was holy, hunger a virtue, appetite a temptation left in the garden with the snake. But in some convents, fasting was a daytime suggestion. When bells stopped ringing and the abbess retired, a different ritual began, the forbidden feast. Convents kept strict diets, porridge, bread, occasional fish, and an existential crisis for dessert. Meat, rich cheeses, sweets, and wine were banned, especially during Lent or the dozens of fasting days that made up half the year. But no one can eat boiled cabbage forever without plotting something. and plot they did. Some nuns developed covert culinary networks. Friendly merchants delivered salted meats for medicinal purposes. Wine was relabeled as consecrated vinegar. Honey cakes were for visitors who never arrived. One convent inventory listed 2 ducks, a whole ham, a jug of cherry wine, and 3 wheels of cheese, catalogued under liturgical supplies. You draw your own conclusions. Midnight feasts became a thing. Candlelit rooms, giggling nuns, whispering psalms between bites of roasted goose. One novice burned her hand, sneaking hot pastries from the oven, and claimed it was punishment from the Holy Spirit. No one bought it, but the pastries were excellent. Sometimes, these feasts became social affairs, with visiting men, merchants, priests, or men with no official reason to be there after dark. One abbey in Burgundy hosted unapproved gatherings, regular Saturday night banquets with dancing, gambling, and what the bishop called inappropriate merriment. Not every nun partook. Many were devout and horrified by such indulgence. But others, their idea of fasting was eating quickly before someone caught them. Few things unnerved church authorities more than a nun with a bump, unless that bump became a baby, then a shallow grave beneath the convent pantry. In a 14th century French convent, rumours swirled of strange noises from the cellar. Not rats, not bad plumbing, but, as one horrified novice described, something crying that had no right to be there. Investigators expected wine stashes or love letters. Instead, they found a hastily dug patch under a barrel of pickled cabbage. Beneath it, a newborn's body, wrapped in a torn wimple, the headdress worn by sisters. The implication was clear. The investigation was delicate, like a plague cart. The mother was never named, though several nuns were relocated shortly after, a euphemism for disappear quietly before this becomes a trial. The abbess claimed ignorance. "I was not informed of any childbirth," she said, standing next to a suspiciously well-used wash basin. She added that any woman who gave birth must have entered already pregnant. An old, ineffective excuse. This wasn't isolated. Across Europe, hidden pregnancies led to tragic ends. Babies were left at monastery doors, smuggled to families, or, heartbreakingly, didn't survive. The church responded with outrage and selective amnesia. Punishments ranged from penance to quiet transfers. But as long as walls stayed high and letters stayed hidden, many stories were buried, literally and figuratively. Every time a cellar was repaved or a pantry reorganized, there was a faint chance of another discovery, a tiny scandal, wrapped in linen and silence. If there's a scale of things nuns shouldn't do, opening a brothel ranks between heresy and throwing a bishop out a window. In 15th century Bologna, Sister Clara decided she'd had enough of vows, veils, and virtue. She left the convent and opened a highly successful brothel in her old convent building, habits still in use. because subtlety wasn't part of the plan. Clara wasn't cloister material to begin with. Records describe her as willful and frequently absent from Vespers, meaning she skipped prayers and likely had plans involving wine and someone named Marco. Her departure wasn't dramatic. She simply walked out and never returned. The drama came later, when passers-by noticed the convent had become very popular with men who had no interest in theology. Clara employed women, some ex-nuns, others creatively unemployed, and ran the place with military efficiency. Clients paid extra for costumes. Some requested the full confession experience, raising theological questions no one was prepared to answer. When word reached the church, panic ensued, not because prostitution was rare, but because this brothel looked like a convent and functioned better than most monasteries. The optics were terrible. Clara, when summoned, shrugged and said, "At least no one here pretends to be chaste." She was excommunicated twice, just to be sure. The building was seized, the operation dismantled, and Clara was sent to a nunnery far from Bologna. Poetic justice, perhaps. Yet her legacy lingered. The site was called the Cloister of Delight, appearing in bawdy plays and songs. Clara became a folk legend, the nun who skipped salvation for hospitality. Confession, the spiritual reset button of medieval Catholicism, was meant to be solemn. Self-examination, humility, penitence. You knelt, whispered your transgressions, received absolution, left lighter. In theory, in practice, confession sometimes led to more sins than it forgave. Enter the confessor scandal, so common it became cliché. The setup: one priest, many nuns, an enclosed space for private talks about temptation. What could go wrong? Quite a lot. Some confessors took their duties seriously. Others saw ministering to the soul as an invitation to explore the rest of the nun's emotional terrain, especially if she was young, anxious, or from a wealthy family whose influence might protect them both. Boundaries were porous, curtains thick, supervision theoretical. In one case, Father Anselm of Tours heard confessions from 30 nuns and developed special spiritual intimacy with 10. The abbess grew suspicious when Sister Magdalene emerged from confession, giggling and smelling of clove wine. Reports trickled in across Europe, confessors meeting nuns at odd hours, receiving love letters disguised as theological questions. One caught with his hand on a novice's knee, claiming he was checking for demonic possession. Creative, at least. The church's response: delicate silence, then reassignment. A confessor accused of misconduct was sent to another diocese to reflect. Medieval for do it elsewhere and don't get caught. Nuns were left in awkward positions, some shamed, others blamed entirely, accused of seducing the priest with feminine charm, meaning existing while under 30. Some refused to confess again, choosing silence over sanctity. Not all mischief involved flesh or desire. Some came from nuns with access to plants that could heal a headache or end a pregnancy, nearly every convent had an herb garden for balms, tinctures, and remedies for ailments from stomach aches to demonic possession. Success with the latter was mixed, but some nuns turned into convent chemists, and the line between medicine and mischief blurred. Apothecary sisters knew their plants too well. Many were trained in abortive herbs like pennyroyal, tansy, and rue, used discreetly to restore irregular cycles. The official explanation: a nervous condition or humoral imbalance. Everyone knew what it meant when a nun visited the herbarium red-faced and shaky. Some convents became known as safe places for women with delicate problems. A noblewoman with an inconvenient pregnancy might suddenly pursue a spiritual retreat, emerging 2 months later slimmer and more devout. Sister Hildegard of Trier was famous, described as an herbalist of great discretion. Her concoctions could calm a restless body, silence an inconvenient cough, or undo what the flesh hath done. Poetic phrasing. The church didn't approve, but turned a blind eye if things stayed quiet and patients left grateful rather than pregnant. Darker rumours spoke of potions slipped into wine or love spells crafted with hair and bone, likely exaggerated, but some convents faced inquiries for witch-like tendencies, a dangerous accusation in 15th century Europe. Public exposure was a spiritual hazard, but for some nuns, it became a legal necessity. Convents occasionally ended up in secular courts over inheritance disputes, dowry claims, property feuds, or behaviour not befitting a bride of Christ. Medieval legal code for someone's been up to something. In Florence, Sister Constanza sued a priest for breach of promise, alleging he seduced her in the confessional, promised to leave the priesthood, then didn't. She provided letters, witnesses, and a pointed poem. The court delayed judgment for 3 years, hoping everyone would die or take vows of silence. In Cologne, an abbess was accused of misusing convent funds for luxury linens, spiced wine, and gifts for visitors, men under 30, unusually well groomed for pilgrims. The trial read like an expense report for a high-end inn. The abbess claimed it was spiritual hospitality. The court disagreed. Sometimes, the church tried to handle things under canon law, but when crimes like theft, child abandonment, or fraud spilled into civil territory, secular judges stepped in, often unprepared for veiled women quoting scripture while denying everything. One nun in Burgundy, charged with attacking another over a man, claimed possession by jealousy and possibly the devil, a 2-for-1 defense that earned reduced penance and relocation. These dramas were quieted quickly. The church didn't enjoy broadcasting its soap operas, but word got out. Taverns buzzed with phrases like, "Did you hear about the nun with the wine bill?" Or, "She brought her dowry and her boyfriend to court." Relics were the medieval version of verified badges, and some convents collected them like teenagers at a clearance sale. Holy bones, cloth scraps, saintly blood. They drew pilgrims, donations, prestige. For many nuns, relics were sacred. For others, revenue streams. Abbess Euphemia of Thuringia claimed her convent housed Mary Magdalene's hairbrush, not a splinter of the true cross, but a grooming tool from Scripture's most misunderstood woman. She called it heaven sent and encouraged pilgrims to kneel and leave coins. The bishop found it was likely a merchant's comb, smelling of rosemary and goat. In Bruges, a convent displayed Saint Apollonia's fingernail, patron saint of toothaches. Scholars found it was cow horn. The abbess insisted the miracle came from faith in the idea, a bold pivot. Some nuns claimed handkerchiefs used by the Virgin Mary, still damp with tears, or thorns from the crown of thorns, despite living far from trade routes. When asked how she acquired it, one smiled. The Lord provides. Not all relics were fake. Some were ancient, mysterious, possibly holy. But with 6 skulls of John the Baptist and 3 navels of Christ, enthusiasm often outpaced accuracy. Relics worked, pilgrims came, coins clinked, and convents unable to attract with sermons found bones, real or not, were excellent marketing. But some nuns weren't just praying, they were running soft power empires, managing land, outmaneuvering bishops, pretending to care about embroidery. Abbesses, often from noble families, understood influence wasn't sinful if called stewardship. Abbess Matilda of Essen ran her abbey like a duchy, negotiating land deals, hosting royals, correcting accounts Latin publicly. She was revered, pious, terrifying. Convents controlled vast estates. The church frowned on women wielding authority but accepted their taxes. Abbesses managed finances, agriculture, tenant disputes, sometimes bribing officials or forging deeds. One convent in Normandy negotiated a treaty with a rival monastery over fishing rights after a dispute turned into a holy turf war. Abbess Julian's peace letter was unusually sharp for a woman sworn to humility. She roasted the abbot in flawless Latin. Noble families installed daughters in convents for strategic placement. A nun from the right lineage could pass information, lobby quietly, or delay papal decisions with lost letters. Some convents had spies, some had lawyers. One German abbey employed a scribe who knew fencing, suggesting their copy editing was intense. The church tried to crack down, but as long as sisters seemed devout, little could be done. You can't excommunicate competence. By the late Middle Ages, some convents were self-contained cities with economies, hierarchies, gossip, secrets, and occasional underground baby swaps. Not all scandal wore a sultry smile or left love letters. Some wore silence, strategic silence that kept reputations intact, covered up crying, blood, sudden illness. Abbess Theodora ruled her convent like a medieval CEO, managing lands, hosting dukes, holding elaborate prayer vigils. When 3 novices turned up pregnant in 1 year, she blamed spiritual temptation and ordered stricter fasting for everyone but herself. When clerics raised questions, she accused them of envy and threatened to withhold prayers for their souls, a chilling flex. Other convents leaned into notoriety. The Abbey of San Lucilla outside Milan was a refuge for reformed women. Former courtesans who prayed 20% of the time and wore expensive robes, 80%. They hosted musical recitals, charged for feast day processions, kept peacocks in the garden. The bishop called them a minor concern. Rome called them profitable. In England, one nun forged indulgences so well they reached York Cathedral, blessed by a bishop. Before anyone noticed, the ink was mixed with berry wine. Even the devout weren't immune to odd practices. One mystic nun claimed visions only when fasting and dancing simultaneously. Her superior banned both, prompting her to invent holy spinning. Visitors thought she was possessed. She insisted it was divine joy at 30 revolutions per minute. Beneath the incense and scripture was raw, stubborn life, clawing through cracks in the marble. And so, we leave the shadowed cloisters of medieval convents, where secrets simmered behind stone walls, and vows bent under the weight of human desire. The nuns' scandals, whispered in Latin, buried in parchment, reveal a world of hidden rebellion. But now, let's step into the blazing sunlight of ancient Greece, where one man rejected secrecy altogether. Meet Diogenes, the philosopher who lived in a jar, barked at hypocrisy, and laughed in the face of convention. If the nuns hid their truths, Diogenes shouted his from the marketplace. Ready for a tale as bold as it is bizarre? Let's dive in. Before he was the world's most legendary barrel-dwelling philosopher, Diogenes was just the son of a banker in the Greek city of Sinope. That's right, the man who would scoff at gold and spit on wealth was born into money. And, well, that didn't last long. Diogenes' life took a turn when he and his father, Hystesias, were implicated in a creative crime, defacing the local currency. Not metaphorically, they were accused of tampering with coins, possibly shaving them down or forging them. It's debated whether Diogenes knew exactly what he was doing or was just helping with the family business. But one thing's clear, the authorities weren't amused. The future cynic was promptly exiled. For most, exile would be a tragedy. For Diogenes, it was a career move. He fled to Athens, the philosophical epicenter of the Greek world, and decided that instead of crawling back into society, he'd dismantle it bit by bit, with sarcasm, a sharp tongue, and a complete disregard for pants. Athens was full of prestigious thinkers. Plato, Aristotle, the whole gang. Diogenes, penniless and technically homeless, didn't care. While others debated metaphysics in linen robes, he rolled into town with a dog-like grin and a mission: expose every shred of hypocrisy he could sniff out. Yes, dog-like isn't a metaphor. He embraced it. He proudly identified with the word kynikos, meaning dog-like in Greek, which is where we get cynic, barking at corruption, biting at convention, licking truth raw and unfiltered. His first order of business, ditching all societal pretense. He renounced possessions, mocked manners, and slept in a giant ceramic jar, often called a barrel, like a philosophical raccoon. It was his ultimate statement. If society was a facade, he'd live outside it. Literally. This wasn't rebellion for rebellion's sake. Diogenes believed virtue came from living in accordance with nature. Nature didn't need money, reputation, or 10-room villas. Just honesty and maybe a sturdy jar. If Athens was the heart of philosophical prestige, Plato was its golden child, polished, revered, and far too serious for Diogenes' taste. While Plato categorized virtues and defined abstract ideals, Diogenes, well, peed on them, literally and figuratively. One famous anecdote involves Plato defining a human as a featherless biped, a clever summary of our species. Diogenes, always ready to weaponize mockery, plucked a chicken and brought it into the academy, declaring, "Behold, Plato's human." The joke landed so hard, Plato had to revise his definition to add, "with broad flat nails." Score 1 for the man in the jar. But Diogenes wasn't just trolling. He believed philosophers like Plato were too wrapped up in abstract nonsense, forgetting to live with integrity. To Diogenes, virtue wasn't debated, it was lived. And if that meant heckling the elite while munching onions and looking homeless, so be it. He made a habit of disrupting Plato's lectures, walking through crowds with a lantern in broad daylight, muttering he was looking for an honest man. The crowd laughed nervously. They knew he was right. Athens, with its democratic ideals and marble buildings, was full of polite lies and philosophical performance. Diogenes tore through it with blunt honesty. Plato reportedly called him Socrates gone mad. Not entirely wrong. Like Socrates, Diogenes asked uncomfortable questions and refused societal rules. But unlike Socrates, he didn't want dialogue. He wanted spectacle. He played the clown to reveal hypocrisy, making the simple life look outrageous. He begged without shame, ate scraps, relieved himself wherever he pleased, to the horror of onlookers. Each action, however crude, was a statement. Why feel shame for natural functions when others felt none for lying, cheating, or hoarding wealth? Plato built ideal worlds. Diogenes smashed the illusions of this one. Yes. And if you asked him, that made him the real philosopher. Even if he smelled of old olives and existential dread, by now, Diogenes was a full-time philosophical menace. He had no address, unless you count the ceramic jar in the marketplace. Like sentient street art, He owned almost nothing, a cloak, a stick, a cup, until he saw a boy drinking water with his hands and threw the cup away. "A child has beaten me in plainness of living," he said. That was Diogenes. He didn't just talk simplicity. He outsimplified everyone. He wasn't pretending to reject wealth while hoarding silver. He lived off scraps, bathed in rainwater, slept with dogs. He called himself a dog, not as insult, but as a badge of honor. Dogs live naturally, without shame, pretense, or obsession with status. That's how Diogenes wanted to live, bark included. Then there was the lamp, or lantern, depending on the translation, carried in daylight. "What are you doing?" people asked. "Looking for an honest man," he'd grumble. The subtext? He wasn't finding one. He wasn't even hopeful. The joke was the point. A slap to everyone who thought themselves virtuous while living lives dripping in compromise. His daily life was performance art. When caught masturbating in public, he quipped, "If only it were as easy to relieve hunger by rubbing my stomach." Crude, absolutely. But for Diogenes, natural acts weren't shameful. Hypocrisy was. He wasn't poor because he had to be. He had offers of shelter, food, even patronage from admirers. He turned them down like dodging a pyramid scheme. Accepting charity meant obligation, and Diogenes wouldn't be leashed, not by money, decorum, or society's awkward coughs when he did something uncivilized. He wasn't on the fringe of society. He planted himself there, sharp, uncomfortable, impossible to ignore. One iconic encounter happened between the dirtiest man in Athens and the most powerful man on earth, Alexander the Great. A young conqueror with the ego of a god and an army to back it up. Alexander was intrigued by Diogenes. Here was a man who had nothing, wanted nothing, feared nothing, yet commanded attention across the Greek world. Alexander found him lounging in his jar, sunbathing like a stray cat, fluent in moral philosophy. The king asked, "Is there anything I can do for you?" Diogenes, without sitting up, replied, "Yes, stand out of my sunlight." Mic drop. Alexander's entourage was horrified. This man dismissed the ruler of the known world like an annoying vendor. But Alexander was impressed. Legend says he turned to his men and said, "If I were not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes." The moment captures Diogenes' essence. In a world obsessed with power, he was untouchable because he wanted nothing. You can't bribe a man who sleeps in a jar, blackmail a man who begs, or impress a man who finds luxury laughable. He taught Alexander and the world that true power comes from needing nothing, fearing no one. In one sentence, he reduced a conqueror to a shadow blocking the sun. Diogenes wasn't just a local eccentric. He was the embodiment of cynicism. Not the grumpy modern version, but something feral, raw, with fleas. He believed society was rotten, built on lies about happiness, virtue, success. People chased wealth, climbed social ladders, stuffed their heads with abstract nonsense. Diogenes said, "No thanks. I'd rather sleep in a pot and eat scraps." Cynicism was about living in harmony with nature, shedding artificial needs, luxury, fame, ambition, and returning to simplicity, self-sufficiency. If nature didn't hand you a golden goblet, maybe you didn't need one. His philosophy was confrontational. He didn't hide his beliefs in essays or scrolls. He lived them loudly, mocking, barking, interrupting lives to expose contradictions. If someone preached virtue but lived lavishly, Diogenes followed them like a heckler, exposing the rot beneath the silk. "Other dogs bite their enemies. I bite my friends to save them," he said. Nothing says friendship like a metaphorical gnaw on the ankle of your delusions. He was brutal toward hypocrisy, especially among philosophers. If a scholar claimed poverty was noble while living in comfort, Diogenes held up a mirror, metaphorically or otherwise. He saw a lavish temple being built and declared, "The gods must have gone blind if they need such a grand house." In a world obsessed with image, he was its predator. He wasn't trying to be liked. He was trying to wake people up. And if that meant barking like a dog or relieving himself on statues, so be it. Truth wasn't always polite. Diogenes was Athens' walking conscience, filthy, loud, inconvenient. Depending on whom you asked, he was a lunatic with bowel control issues, or the only sane man in a city of liars. Maybe both. He made a career of offending. During a feast, he walked barefoot across a banquet hall's expensive carpet, wiping off mud, muttering, "Thus I trample on the pride of Plato." Not RSVP behavior, but for Diogenes, it was protest against vanity, excess, hollow rituals. He challenged everyone. Seeing a wealthy man donate to the poor for admiration, he muttered, "That's not charity, that's investment." Seeing a man angry at being slapped, he said, "You shouldn't be upset. It was just flesh striking flesh." Psychological judo. His genius wasn't just in words. It was how he lived. His existence critiqued everything people took for granted. He turned the world upside down, waiting to see what coins fell out. Ridiculed, attacked, even arrested. Trying to arrest a man with no possessions or shame was like confiscating smoke. Once captured and sold as a slave, he told the auctioneer, "Sell me to a man who needs a master." He ended up with a Corinthian, Xeniades, who let him run the household, educate the children, become a sarcastic life coach, even in slavery. Diogenes stayed consistent. Mocking power structures he accidentally joined. If praised too much, he'd remind people he was just a dog chasing truth, occasionally peeing on golden statues. Society's permanent splinter. The more you ignored him, the deeper he lodged in your conscience. Diogenes didn't just reject social conventions. He waged war on them with the ferocity of a barefoot prophet and the hygiene of a disobedient raccoon. Bathing? Overrated. Dining etiquette? Pointless. Shame? A tool for cowards and hypocrites. He believed norms existed to control. Shame. Separate the powerful from the poor. So he defied them all. He walked barefoot through broken streets, even in winter. Asked why no shoes. He said, "If I were in need of shoes, I'd be more distressed about my life than my feet." He performed embarrassing bodily functions publicly, not out of ignorance, but as statements. If something was natural and necessary, it shouldn't be shameful. If you scold me for burping, but not for cheating your neighbour, your moral compass is broken. Even begging was resistance. While most beggars appealed to pity, Diogenes treated it as a spiritual test for himself and the person asked. If they gave, fine. If not, fine. Either way, he stayed honest and hungry. His existence was an experiment. How little does a person need to live well? Not just survive, but live with dignity, freedom, a humour sharp enough to slice through pomp. He exposed the absurdity of conventions by ignoring them. The more people insisted he behave, the more he doubled down, proving civilized behaviors were rituals to feel superior. In a world of masks, Diogenes was barefaced, probably barefoot, laughing in the sun, asking why we weren't. Diogenes left no memoirs, marble busts, or temples. He wouldn't have wanted them. If someone tried to build him a statue, he'd probably spit on it. His legacy lives in what he destroyed. Illusions, pretensions, egos. His death is surrounded by stories, tragic, ridiculous, fitting. Some say he died holding his breath from boredom. Others claim an infected dog bite. Irony not lost on anyone. Another version, he lay down, said nothing, didn't get up. No grand last words, no dramatic curtain, just the world's loudest cynic slipping away, as if even death didn't impress him. Asked how to be buried, Mill, he said. Throw me outside the city wall. Let the beasts have me. Shocked, someone asked if he worried about animals tearing him apart. Not if you give me a stick to chase them away, he replied. But you won't be able to use it, lad, they said. Then why should I care? What happens when I'm dead? Diogenes. 1. Mortality. 0. His teachings spread like wildfire among those tired of hypocrisy. His cynicism inspired Stoics like Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius, who borrowed self-sufficiency and virtue untainted by wealth. Even today, in an age of filters, followers, and fortune, Diogenes feels relevant. True freedom isn't owning more, it's needing less. Dignity comes from living your values, even if that includes yelling at statues and living in a barrel. He died penniless, homeless, barefoot, but left something more durable than gold. Uncomfortable truth, the kind that sticks in your brain like a splinter, daring you to laugh at yourself. or at least question why you're not carrying a lantern. You'd think a man who barked at citizens, slept in a jar, and scolded Plato would be a forgotten footnote. Yet Diogenes is a symbol, not of madness, but radical honesty in a world of illusion. We still talk about him over 2,000 years later. That says something. People are hungry for truth, even if it smells of onions and lives in a barrel. Diogenes matters because his life was a provocation. He dared to ask, what happens when you stop playing along? What if you stop chasing wealth, reputation, comfort, and just live with what you need? Strip away the lies, the curated identities. What's left? According to Diogenes, real freedom in a society built on image, ancient Athens or Instagram. His rejection of appearances hits hard. He didn't just question authority or wealth, he questioned the need for them. That's why thinkers, from Stoics to anarchists to comedians, draw inspiration from him. He's the original minimalist, the spiritual grandfather of every "I quit my six-figure job to live in a van" story online. His crudeness had purpose. He used shock not to offend, but to expose. He wanted people to feel discomfort, because that's where reflection starts. If you're more disturbed by someone relieving themselves in public than by corruption or greed, Diogenes would say, your priorities are upside down. His message is timeless. Virtue isn't bought, branded, or broadcast. It's how you live when no one's watching. Or, in Diogenes' case, when everyone is watching and you just don't care. He reminds us wisdom doesn't always wear robes. Sometimes it shouts from a jar, laughs in your face, refuses to move out of the sunlight. In a world of noise, branding, and nonsense, Diogenes invites us to be honest, unfiltered, a little bit dog-like, and maybe, just maybe, that makes him the wisest lunatic who ever lived. We've just left Diogenes, the jar-dwelling cynic of ancient Greece, who mocked empires and lived free by owning nothing. His sharp wit sliced through Athens' hypocrisy, a lone voice daring to defy the world's rules. But now, we leap across centuries and seas to the windswept plains of America in 1876. Here, no single philosopher challenges the system. Entire tribes rise to defend their way of life. The Battle of Little Bighorn awaits, a clash of cultures, courage, and tragedy, where freedom's cost is measured in blood. Ready for a story that shakes the earth? Let's ride in. By the early 1870s, the northern plains were seething with tension, a slow, grinding build-up of broken promises, land theft, and cultural collision. At the heart was the Black Hills, sacred to the Lakota Sioux, who called it Paha Sapa. The U.S. government recognized this territory as theirs in the 1868 Fort Laramie Treaty. On paper, the land was theirs forever. But forever lasted about 6 years. Everything changed in 1870 when gold was discovered in the Black Hills by an expedition led by George Armstrong Custer. Word spread, and like flies to honey, thousands of prospectors poured in, violating the treaty, desecrating sacred ground. The government, well, rather than enforce its agreement, tried to buy the land. The Lakota refused. This wasn't just about gold. It was about survival, sovereignty, the erosion of their way of life. To Washington, the Lakota and their allies were now hostiles. They weren't negotiating, they were resisting. The U.S. Army was ordered to bring all native groups onto reservations by January 31st, 1876. Any who didn't comply would be enemies. Many didn't receive the message, scattered across vast winter hunting grounds. Others simply refused. They had no intention of abandoning freedom for confinement. What was forming wasn't just disagreement. It was a collision course, a loose alliance of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors, led by legendary figures like Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, began to gather. Not a formal army, but bound by purpose, to protect their land, their people, their way of life. They knew war was coming. Meanwhile, U.S. military planners, confident in their numbers and technology, saw the tribes as disorganized, divided. They couldn't have been more wrong. The Plains warriors were mobile, knew the terrain intimately, and were motivated by the deepest cause. The powder keg was lit. The fuse was burning. Soon, the clash that would become the Battle of Little Bighorn was hurtling toward history. George Armstrong Custer wasn't your average officer. By 1876, he was a household name, a flamboyant, divisive Civil War hero with a reputation for boldness, recklessness, and a dangerous addiction to glory. With flowing blonde hair, flashy uniforms, and an appetite for headlines, Custer seemed more suited to a stage than a battlefield. Yet his daring earned both respect and resentment. After the Civil War, he was assigned to the western frontier as a lieutenant colonel in the 7th U.S. Cavalry. His job: enforce federal Indian policy, forcing tribes onto reservations, peacefully if possible, violently if necessary. By 1876, Custer was eager for a fight. His political ambitions simmered. A decisive victory could restore his reputation after a public feud with President Ulysses S. Grant's administration. He wasn't just chasing natives, he was chasing relevance. As tensions escalated, Custer joined a three-pronged campaign to locate and subdue the hostiles. The plan: encircle native encampments and force submission. Custer's column approached from the east, General John Gibbons from the west, General George Crooks from the south. But the plan suffered from overconfidence and poor coordination. The terrain was rugged, distances vast, intelligence shaky. Most officers, including Custer, believed they faced a small, scattered group of warriors. They had no idea thousands of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered near the Little Bighorn River, the largest native force ever assembled on the plains. Custer, as usual, wanted to strike quickly, claim glory. He declined reinforcements, refused Gatling guns that would slow him, ignored orders to wait. Instead, he pushed ahead with his 600 men, splitting them into 3 battalions for a surprise attack. It was audacious, bold, catastrophically misinformed. What lay ahead wasn't a broken village of stragglers. It was a unified, battle-hardened force ready to defend its way of life. Custer, with his signature flair, was about to ride into legend and disaster. While the U.S. Army operated on faulty maps and assumptions, something extraordinary was happening along the Little Bighorn River. Thousands of Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho had gathered, not for war initially, but for a traditional summer encampment, a time to rest, hunt, hold ceremonies, be together as families and allies. But the political reality of 1876 cast a long shadow. Native leaders knew what was coming. They'd seen treaties broken, buffalo herds disappear, railroads and settlers encroach. This peaceful encampment might soon become a battlefield. They weren't going to run. At the center was Sitting Bull, a hunk Papa Lakota holy man and visionary leader. In the weeks before the battle, he performed a grueling sun dance, a ceremony of sacrifice and prayer. Witnesses say he had a vision, soldiers falling into the camp like grasshoppers, defeated, broken. For his followers, this was no metaphor, it was prophecy. Then there was Crazy Horse, a warrior of mythical skill and bravery, quiet, reclusive, deeply committed to protecting his people. He'd earned a reputation in earlier battles. He'd soon prove himself again, charging into enemy lines with daring and tactical brilliance. Other leaders, like Gol and Two Moons, emerged as key voices. Though the tribes lacked centralized command, their unity was remarkable. They were defending more than land, freedom itself. Estimates vary, but there were 8,000 to 10,000 people in the Little Bighorn Valley, including 1,500 to 2,000 warriors. Well armed, many with repeating rifles, superior terrain knowledge, and fighting for their homes, families, way of life. They were formidable. Custer expected a few hundred desperate warriors. He faced a coalition born of spiritual resolve, ancestral duty, and a fierce will to survive. The storm was gathering. On June 22nd, 1876, Custer and his 7th Cavalry left the Rosebud River, following tracks believed to lead to a native encampment. For 3 days, they moved fast, too fast, pushing men and horses to exhaustion. Custer was convinced the village would scatter if they sensed soldiers. He wanted to strike first, strike hard, claim glory before General Terry or Gibbon arrived. His urgency blinded him to caution. Scouts, including Crow and Arikara warriors, warned Custer the village ahead was massive, unlike anything they'd seen. Some climbed ridges, returned wide-eyed, too many to count. They urged him to wait, reconsider. He didn't. On the morning of June 25th, Custer reached a ridge overlooking the Little Bighorn Valley. He saw parts of the encampment, teepees stretching along the river like a small city, smoke rising, children playing, horses grazing. What he saw as a vulnerable camp was a sleeping giant. Believing he could surprise them, Custer divided his 600-man regiment. Captain Frederick Benteen scouted south with 125 men. Major Marcus Reno attacked the southern end with 140. Custer took about 210 men northward to flank the village, hoping for a pincer move. It was bold, risky, based on false assumptions. The warriors already knew he was coming. Lakota scouts had spotted dust trails. The element of surprise was lost before it began. At around 3 p.m. on June 25th, 1876, Reno's men charged the southern end of the encampment, expecting panic. Women and children fleeing, warriors scrambling. Instead, they met organized, furious resistance. Within minutes, the charge unraveled. Reno's men dismounted in the timber along the river, opened fire, but the returning fire shocked them. The warriors were numerous, aggressive, fast, coordinated. Lakota and Cheyenne surged across open ground, many on horseback, firing with deadly accuracy. Some carried Winchesters and Spencer repeating rifles, more advanced than the cavalry's single-shot carbines. Reno panicked, gave a chaotic order to mount and retreat across the river. In the scramble, soldiers were shot, some drowned. The retreat became a rout, bloodied, disorganized. Reno's men staggered up a bluff, later called Reno Hill, trying to form a defensive position. Captain Benteen arrived with reinforcements. Together, they established a rough perimeter, low on water, surrounded under constant fire. They heard distant gunfire to the north, Custer's fate unfolding, but didn't know what was happening. Messengers sent never returned. Meanwhile, in the valley, warriors swarmed. Emboldened by Reno's retreat, spirits rose. The prophecy was coming true. The invaders weren't invincible. They were fleeing, and more were coming. U.S. Campaigns on the plains had been predictable. Overwhelming force, fast strikes, harsh retaliation. But this was different. The warriors fought on their terms, mobile, determined, fueled by vision and rage. While Reno clung to life on the hilltop, unsure what went wrong, Custer continued north, unaware his tactical framework had collapsed. The battle was no longer about strategy. It was survival. Custer's clock was ticking, while Reno's forces retreated in chaos and Benteen fortified Reno Hill. Custer and his 210 men pressed north. Still under the illusion, the village could be attacked from multiple directions. They moved along high ground, hoping to strike the rear, but the warriors knew he was coming. The alarm had spread through the massive encampment. Hundreds of Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors surged toward Custer's column. Instead of finding women and children to capture, he faced a tidal wave of mounted fighters. His troops were stretched thin along ridges, trying to hold defensive positions, but were quickly surrounded. The precise sequence remains debated. No survivors from Custer's immediate command, but it's clear the 7th Cavalry was overwhelmed in hours. Led by warriors like Crazy Horse and Gall, the native forces outmaneuvered and outnumbered Custer's men. Their terrain knowledge and aggressive tactics shredded the cavalry's lines. The soldiers tried to stand on what became Last Stand Hill, surrounded, out of ammunition, no escape. They fell, some in groups, some alone, some reportedly shooting themselves rather than be captured. Native accounts describe the battle as brutal, fast, not just a fight, a collapse. Custer was killed in the final moments, likely shot through the chest and head, found among a cluster of men, including his brothers Tom and Boston. Nearly every soldier in his command, over 200 men, was wiped out. For the native warriors, it was a staggering, emotional victory, but not celebrated with triumphalism. Some accounts describe mourning, not cheering, and understanding that while they won the battle, the war was far from over. The U.S. Army would return, and this glory would meet vengeance. Still, for one day in Montana's rolling hills, the unstoppable machine of westward expansion faltered. Custer, the bold commander chasing legacy, found it, not in conquest, but annihilation. When the dust settled on the evening of June 25th, silence returned to the Little Bighorn. Fires smouldered, ammunition belts lay scattered. Over 200 soldiers lay dead, including Custer and nearly every officer under him. The battlefield was littered with broken weapons, fallen horses, bodies of men who never saw it coming. The native victory, as complete as it was, came with grim understanding. This wasn't the end, but a spark. The U.S. government, humiliated, enraged, would not forgive. Back east, newspapers screamed of Custer's last stand, casting him as a martyr, the warriors as bloodthirsty. The context, treaty violations, the gold rush, the defensive nature of the fight was erased. Native families mourned their losses too. Victorious, they'd suffered casualties. They knew retaliation was coming. Leaders like Sitting Bull urged their people to move quickly. The encampment dismantled, scattered into smaller bands across the plains, preparing for what they knew would follow. Relief troops discovered the battlefield 2 days later. A grim, haunting scene. Many soldiers were stripped of uniforms, a warrior custom to deprive enemies of dignity. Some bodies were mutilated, others untouched, depending on tribal customs and the fight's intensity. No one could deny what happened. Custer was gone, the 7th Cavalry decimated. For a fleeting moment, Native resistance achieved the impossible. They won. The Battle of Little Bighorn was more than a military clash. It became a symbol, warped and weaponized by history. For the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho, a rare, hard-won victory against overwhelming odds. For the U.S. government, a humiliation demanding merciless retribution. In the American imagination, the narrative twisted. Custer became a tragic hero, the valiant general of a last stand. His reckless tactics, the arrogance, the invasion of treaty-protected lands, all swept under patriotic mythology. The press called it a massacre, erasing the fact it was a defensive battle on native land. But among native communities, it was remembered differently, a moment of unity, bravery, prophecy fulfilled. The encampment at Little Bighorn was a final, shining moment of freedom before reservation life closed in. A point of pride, a testament to resistance, resilience. The cost came swiftly. Within months, military campaigns intensified. Buffalo herds, already devastated, were deliberately targeted to destroy the native food supply. Tribes were pursued relentlessly. By 1877, Crazy Horse was dead, killed under suspicious circumstances. Sitting Bull fled to Canada, but was later killed in 1890, days before the Wounded Knee Massacre, another tragic milestone in the erasure of native sovereignty. The legacy of Little Bighorn is twofold: inspiration and mourning. It exposed the cruelty of U.S. expansion, broken promises, the ferocity of a people who refuse to be erased quietly. Today, the battlefield is a national memorial. For years, it honored only Custer and his men. Now, memorials honor the native warriors, not as villains, but heroes defending their homelands. The hills remember both sides. The wind carries both songs. The legacy of Little Bighorn speaks. If you're willing to listen to more than one version of history, in the arc of American history, Little Bighorn stands out. A rare moment when the underdog didn't just fight back, they won. For one day in 1876, native warriors held back an empire's tide, not with numbers, technology, or wealth, but courage, unity, an unshakable will to protect their way of life. The tragedy? This victory didn't change history's outcome. It only delayed it. In fact, it accelerated the end. Custer's defeat enraged Washington. Public opinion hardened. Sympathy for native grievances was buried under vengeance and nationalism. Congress increased military funding. Campaigns intensified with brutal precision. Within years, the nomadic life of the Lakota, Cheyenne, and Arapaho was gone. Buffalo were nearly extinct. Reservations carved up the land. Hills, once echoing with hooves and war cries, now silent. Yet Little Bighorn refuses to fade. Over decades, it's been reinterpreted, reimagined, reclaimed. For many Americans, it started as heroic sacrifice. For others, a symbol of injustice, a nation that broke its word and called resistance treason. Today, the site is one of few battlefields where both sides are remembered, markers not all pointing one way. For Native peoples, it's not the beginning of defeat, but a final, brilliant stand of a free people, a moment when everything being taken, land, freedom, dignity, was fought for with every ounce of spirit. A sacred memory. For the rest of us, Little Bighorn offers a difficult, necessary lesson about power, myth, the cost of conquest. History isn't always told by victors. Sometimes it's buried beneath them, waiting to be unearthed. The dust has settled on the plains of Little Bighorn, where warriors fought for freedom in a clash that echoed across history. Blood and bravery marked the land, a fleeting victory against an encroaching empire. Now, we journey far from those open fields to the heart of another empire, one of crimson walls and golden roofs. Welcome to the Forbidden City, where emperors ruled as gods, and secrets whispered through gilded halls. From the chaos of battle to the silence of a palace, are you ready to step into a world of power and intrigue? Let's enter. The Forbidden City wasn't just built, it was conjured into existence with ambition, labor, and a deep desire for control. In 1406, the Yongle Emperor of the Ming Dynasty ordered a new imperial palace in Beijing, aiming to move the capital from Nanjing. This wasn't to be any ordinary palace. It would become the heart of the Chinese Empire, a fortified city within a city, where no one entered unless summoned, and no secrets left its walls unfiltered. Over the next 14 years, more than 1 million laborers, craftsmen, and engineers worked to complete this enormous undertaking. Materials came from every corner of the empire. Golden Nanmu wood from Sichuan, giant marble blocks hauled across frozen rivers, millions of glazed roof tiles baked to perfection, brick by brick. An empire's pride was set in stone. When finished, the Forbidden City covered nearly 180 acres, housing over 900 buildings. Its layout followed strict Confucian principles, symmetrical, orderly, hierarchical. At its core lay the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors were crowned, decrees thundered through the bureaucracy. But beyond the grandeur, the deeper purpose was psychological. This wasn't just a residence, it was a statement. The emperor does not live among you, he lives above you. Make no mistake, it was truly forbidden. The average Beijing citizen never stepped foot inside. Even high officials entered only by imperial permission. Guards stood at every gate. Spies lurked in every corridor. The outer city bustled with markets, common life. Inside the red walls, time slowed, ceremony ruled, a world locked in ritual, cloaked in mystery, insulated from daily life's messiness. But beneath its golden rooftops and crimson columns, the Forbidden City was a pressure cooker, built to isolate, to centralize power, to shield the emperor from threats, physical and political. It became a place of intrigue, betrayal, whispers in the shadows. A palace, yes, but also a stage for 5 centuries of empire, ambition, and slow unraveling. From the outside, it dazzled. From the inside, it watched and never forgot who walked its halls. At the heart sat the Emperor, the Son of Heaven, the living bridge between mortal and divine. But for all his cosmic authority, the man on the throne led a life of extraordinary isolation. The Forbidden City didn't just protect him, it consumed him. Every day was scripted with suffocating precision. He awoke to music, was dressed by attendants, followed a schedule so ritualized it bordered on theatrical. Meals were sampled for poison, documents read aloud by kneeling ministers. Even a garden stroll required ceremonial clearance and escorts. Nothing was spontaneous. Everything was watched. The emperor sat atop the hierarchy, but he was far from free. The structure that elevated him imprisoned him, surrounded by layers of eunuchs, ministers, consorts, spies. He rarely saw the outside world. His information was filtered, interactions managed, his ability to act independently, especially in later dynasties, stifled by court protocols. Some emperors, like Yongle or Kangxi, ruled with ruthless efficiency, mastering the bureaucracy. Others fell into paranoia, decadence, detachment, lost in their own palace like gilded ghosts. Some spent months, even years, within the Forbidden City without stepping outside. The world they ruled might as well have been on the moon. Even access to the emperor was tightly controlled. High-ranking officials waited days for an audience. Family had limited contact. Heaven helped the servant who crossed the wrong threshold. Protocol dictated where you stood, how you bowed, what you could see. In theory, the emperor commanded legions with a word. In practice, he often struggled to know whom to trust or what was happening beyond his walls. The throne was carved from jade, set above dragons, but surrounded by curtains, layers of secrecy and ceremony. The Forbidden City crowned its emperor in gold, but also wrapped him in silence. Behind every throne stood an invisible army, not generals or ministers, but eunuchs, castrated men who served within the palace. Eunuchs began as humble servants, but evolved into some of the most powerful, feared figures in imperial China. In a world where women were cloistered and men were threats, eunuchs occupied a strange middle space, intimate with the emperor, yet politically useful because they could never father rival dynasties. At first, their duties were simple: managing chores, delivering messages, caring for robes. But as emperors became more secluded, especially during the Ming and Qing dynasties, eunuchs filled the vacuum. They controlled access to the emperor, filtered information, took over administrative functions. Some wielded more power than generals. Others had the emperor's ear in ways his family didn't. And with power came ambition and corruption. The history of eunuchs is a cycle of rise and ruin. For every loyal servant, there was a scheme of manipulating decisions, silencing opponents, hoarding wealth. Some, like Wei Zhongxian in the late Ming, effectively ran the empire from behind silk screens. His enemies disappeared, allies were promoted, entire ministries lived in fear of his whispers. But their influence wasn't just political, it was personal. Eunuchs cared for the emperor from childhood, watched him grow, became surrogate fathers, mentors, or enablers. Their presence was constant, in his chambers, study, court. If the emperor was lonely, they knew, and sometimes exploited it. Yet their lives were far from luxurious. Many were forcibly castrated as boys, often from poor families, hoping to secure a future. Those who survived the brutal operation and years of menial work could, with cunning, rise in rank. But they were always viewed with suspicion by Confucian scholars and military elites, tolerated, used, scapegoated when things went wrong. In a city of ceremony and secrecy, eunuchs were the silent hands moving the pieces, not kings, not pawns, but something far more complicated, far more dangerous. Beyond the grand halls and towering gates lay the Forbidden City's most secretive zone, the inner court, the emperor's private world, a maze of palaces, gardens, sleeping chambers, hidden deep behind red walls. Here, the business of state gave way to the business of dynasty, consorts, concubines, children. Here, politics took a more intimate form, where beauty, jealousy, and bloodlines ruled. The inner court had 3 main palaces for the emperor and 6 residences for the empress and concubines. Don't be fooled by serene names and fragrant gardens. This was no peaceful retreat. It was a battlefield with dozens, sometimes hundreds, of women competing for favor. A world of veiled threats, whispered alliances, calculated ambition. At the top stood the empress, the emperor's legal wife, holding rank and ceremony, but not always his affection. The emperor's heart and heirs often came from concubines whose status could rise or fall overnight based on a glance, a pregnancy, a rumor. Some bore sons and rose to power. Others faded into obscurity, names forgotten, futures erased. Palace maids and senior eunuchs acted as intermediaries, messengers, sometimes spies. Nothing happened unseen. Nothing was forgotten. The women had little freedom, but wielded influence subtly through charm, manipulation, sometimes poison. Occasionally, a consort gained such favor she effectively ruled through the emperor. Empress Dowager Cixi rose from low-ranking concubine to virtual ruler of China for nearly half a century. Her power began in these walls, behind closed doors, in silken robes, with a brilliant mind cloaked in patience. To outsiders, the inner court was silent, perfumed, a place of art, music, refinement. Behind latticed windows and painted screens, it was a pressure chamber where status, survival, lineage collided. Power didn't just march in boots and robes. It tiptoed through moonlit corridors in embroidered slippers, smiling sweetly, waiting to strike. Inside the Forbidden City, every gesture had meaning, every step, bow, incense offering. Nothing was casual. This wasn't just a palace. It was a divine machine. The emperor wasn't just a man. He was the son of heaven, the bridge between earthly and celestial. Every movement had cosmic weight. It wasn't just about power. It was about order. Each morning, officials lined up at the Meridian Gate before sunrise, waiting for the morning court audience. These sessions were brief, choreographed. Ministers knelt, spoke only when spoken to, delivered memorials with practiced humility. Outside, they were powerful men. Inside, shadows at the emperor's feet. The grandest ritual was the winter solstice ceremony, where the emperor offered sacrifices at the temple of heaven to ensure harmony between heaven and earth. These weren't optional. They were political theatre on a sacred scale. A failed ritual, bad weather, a forgotten step signalled the mandate of heaven might be weakening. Inside the palace, rituals governed everything: weddings, funerals, births, meals. The emperor's food was inspected, tasted for poison, arranged by tradition. Changing the menu without permission could ripple chaos through kitchens and court. The most telling ritual: silence. You didn't speak to the emperor unless spoken to. You didn't look him in the eye. Even his family bowed, rose, retreated backward. Distance was mandatory, intimacy rare. The obsession with ritual became a double-edged sword. It preserved continuity, structure, legitimacy across centuries. But it paralyzed decision-making. Ministers debated protocol while the world changed. Foreign powers advanced. Revolutions stirred. Inside, officials argued over ceremonial steps for a royal procession. The rituals that cemented power began to calcify it, like a beautifully painted clock whose hands no longer moved. The performance continued, flawless, precise, increasingly irrelevant. Beneath lacquered beams and golden tiles lay a world not seen in paintings, a world of shadows, Whispers, endless suspicion. The walls kept enemies out, but couldn't keep ambition in. In a palace where power was concentrated, inherited, often unstable, the greatest dangers weren't armies at the gates. They were servants in your chamber. Spying wasn't just common, it was institutionalized. Eunuchs reported to other eunuchs. Palace maids gossiped in coded whispers. Concubines bribed or blackmailed servants for information on rivals. The emperor's word was law, but he often didn't know whom to trust. Paranoia was routine. Letters were opened, conversations overheard. An offhand remark twisted into treason. False accusations flourished. Ministers rose to glory one day, were exiled the next, based on a whisper. Families disappeared overnight. Some chose suicide over trial, knowing the fate awaiting them. Eunuchs were both participants and enforcers in this invisible war. While some were loyal, others built spy networks, rivaling secret police. Under the Ming, the Eastern Depot, a eunuch-run intelligence agency, had terrifying power, arresting, interrogating, executing without consulting the civil government. Torture was standard, confessions extracted like teeth. Scholars and officials resented eunuchs' influence, but weren't above intrigue themselves. The court was a chessboard. Every promotion, marriage, edict a move in an endless game. Even the emperor was a pawn, especially if young, sickly, or uninterested in ruling. Regents and dowagers pulled strings, smiling in daylight, striking by night. Success demanded silence, cunning, and impeccable memory for allegiances. One misstep, even an unguarded look, could be fatal. Yet people schemed, because in the Forbidden City, no prize was higher than proximity to the throne, and no fall deeper than losing it. Beneath the rituals and red walls, the city never slept, only watched and waited. The Forbidden City looked eternal, golden roofs glowing, red walls unshaken by time, but inside, dynasties rose and crumbled with alarming frequency. Power, divine from a distance, was dangerously mortal up close. Sometimes, the empire didn't fall on a battlefield. It fell in a quiet corridor, behind a locked door, whispered out of existence by those closest to the throne. The Ming dynasty, which built the Forbidden City, ruled for nearly 3 centuries. By the 1600s, it staggered under bureaucracy, corruption, peasant uprisings. The palace became a maze of ceremonial obsessions and eunuch dominance, while famine brewed outside. In 1644, as rebel armies closed in, the last Ming emperor hanged himself in the palace gardens, leaving a note lamenting his failure and a palace ripe for takeover. The Manchus, a foreign power from the northeast, swept in, established the Qing dynasty. Remarkably, they kept the Forbidden City as their seat, adapting its traditions while inserting their own. The architecture remained, but language, dress, rituals evolved. The red walls absorbed the shock, kept the illusion of continuity. The Qing ruled from the Forbidden City for another 268 years, through prosperity and devastating collapse. Late Qing emperors, especially in the 19th century, struggled with Western imperialism, internal rebellions, technological stagnation. Empress Dowager Cixi ruled from behind a curtain, literally, manipulating politics while refusing reforms that might have saved the empire. By 1908, when the boy Emperor Puyi ascended, the Forbidden City was more museum than power center. In 1912, the Qing fell, ending over 2 millennia of imperial rule. Oddly, Puyi remained inside for another 13 years, like a ghost wandering the ruins of his past. The emperors were gone, but the city remained, hollowed out, majestic, haunted by vanished dynasties. After the Qing fell in 1912, the Forbidden City should have gone silent. Instead, it entered its strangest chapter. The monarchy was gone. China, a republic. Yet inside the crimson walls, a child emperor remained, Puyi, age 6, still dressed in dragon robes, bowing to empty rituals, ruling over nothing. A political compromise let him stay in the inner court, cut off from Beijing's changing streets. Outside, warlords battled. Revolution reshaped society. Inside, time stood still. Eunuchs continued duties. Meals served ceremonially. The emperor woke, dressed, was bowed to, a monarch without a monarchy, a boy in a shattered dream. Puyi wasn't blind. As he grew, he questioned his world. He read smuggled newspapers, saw airplanes overhead. Modernity buzzed outside while he lived in fading grandeur. He knew the empire was gone. His isolation bred resentment, curiosity, defiance. In 1923, a suspicious fire destroyed precious treasures. Puyi accused eunuchs of theft, sabotage, expelled hundreds. Centuries of tradition vanished overnight. By 1924, warlord Feng Yuxiang expelled Puyi entirely. The emperor, now a young man, was escorted out through gates his ancestors ruled from for generations. In a rickshaw, no throne, no honor guard, just a displaced figure wrapped in memory. Puyi's story didn't end there. He collaborated with the Japanese, became a puppet ruler in Manchuria, was captured, imprisoned, re-educated by the communist regime. In his final years, he worked as a gardener in Beijing, not far from the palace that once defined him. Puyi was the last to live in the Forbidden City. When he left, he took the empire's final breath. Today, the Forbidden City no longer hides secrets. It displays them. Renamed the Palace Museum, it's open to millions. Once off limits, it's now a monument to imperial grandeur and the complicated layers of history, power, identity that shaped a civilization. Visitors pass under towering red walls that once intimidated diplomats, echoed with eunuchs' footsteps. Golden roofs still gleam, dragon motifs as fierce as ever. Instead of guards and courtiers, you'll find tour guides, selfie sticks, school children with notebooks. The Forbidden City houses over 1.8 million artifacts, scrolls, paintings, porcelain, ceremonial garments, weapons, emperor's belongings. But beyond objects, the silence lingers most, in rooms that dictated the fate of millions. Empty thrones, closed doors, vast courtyards, whispering stories stronger than exhibit labels. Restoration keeps the complex intact, yet it's more than preserved. It's transformed. A living museum, a national symbol, a place where autocracy's memory serves public education. The irony isn't lost. A palace built to exclude is now one of Earth's most visited places. Beneath tourist chatter and camera flashes, the site's weight persists. You feel it in the Hall of Supreme Harmony, where emperors stood above kneeling courts. You feel it in the inner court's shaded corridors, where whispers decided destinies. You feel it in the gardens, where lonely rulers wandered among rock sculptures, longing for a world they could barely touch. The Forbidden City is China's mirror, grandeur, control, vulnerability, endurance. Not just a relic, but a framework for understanding how history shapes the present, from isolation to revolution to public memory. It has seen every chapter and continues to watch, not as a seat of power, but as a witness to everything that followed the empire's last breath. And so, our journey through the echoes of history comes to a close. For now, from scandalous cloisters to defiant philosophers, from battle-scarred plains to forbidden palaces, these stories aren't just tales. They're truths carved in parchment, etched in stone, and uncovered by tireless scholars. Every twist, every secret, every triumph and tragedy we've shared is drawn from authentic historical records, original chronicles, archaeological finds, and modern academic research. This is no mere legend. It's the pulse of the past, brought to life for you. Feeling curious? There's a vast world of history waiting out there, full of mysteries yet to unravel. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and join us next time to uncover more secrets from the ages. Until then, let history whisper its lessons and inspire your next adventure.